Hello, everyone.
Hello, Michelle.
How are you?
Very well.
I just wanted to welcome everyone here today. First of all, my name is Michelle Leach and I'm the Land Care Coordinator for Heytesbury District Land Care Network. And first of all, the recording has already started for this video. So if you could please keep your camera and microphone off for the presentation and just pop any questions you have into the chat and Jade will get to them as soon as she's ready for that after her presentation. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. For me, that's the Corangamite people of the Eastern Mar Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So if you're ready to go, Jade, if you could present your multi-species demonstration results, that would be great. Thank you.
Certainly. I might just have to get you to share, enable screen sharing.
Yep. Has that worked?
Yes, it has. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone see the presentation?
Yes, thank you.
Lovely. Okay, so we'll get started. So my name is Jade Killoran. I'm lucky enough to work with Land Care networks across Victoria, mainly in livestock systems, to trial and hopefully adopt multi-species pastures on farms. So paddock scale projects across Victoria is how I'm lucky enough to be employed, which is really great. This particular sowing was the result of several projects that Heytesbury District Land Care Network have undertaken in the southwest and supported by the DemoDAIRY Foundation as well. So we'll get into what is a multi-species first before we get onto the trial results, just in case anyone is a little unclear. So a multi-species mix in a livestock sense is a diverse mix of plant species that we deliberately sow together to optimise fodder production, but also soil health benefits. When I'm doing up a mix for farmers, I like to optimise the functional diversity of the mix. So 5 to 12 species is usually about the sweet spot for the multi-species mixes in terms of functional diversity and also budget. So when I'm doing up a mix, and I'm looking to make it functionally diverse, that means I cover off on 4 main plant groups. So they're grass, members of the grass family, which is the Poaceae family, members of the legume family, which is Fabaceae, and then tall and short broadleaves, so non-leguminous broadleaves. And they can be things in the tall group of broadleaves, such things as chicory or tillage radish, and in the short broadleaves, they can be plantain, buckwheat, linseed, those sorts of plants. So that's what I mean by a functionally diverse mix, is that we cover off on those 4 main plant groups, and that really helps our soil biology thrive. The reason why that happens is that we activate soil biology with a diverse set of root systems. So the biology really respond to living roots in the system, but the diversity of those living roots. And that underpins this regenerative ag concept with the multi-species, is the diversity of the mix is crucially important. So not only do we activate lots of different soil biology when we have diverse living roots in the mix compared to a more low diversity pasture, but we also, because of that diversity, have those living roots in the system for a longer period of the year. So there's more biological activity day to day because of the diversity of the root systems, but also across the year as well. We're optimizing the length of that biological activity. So we can kickstart this process by improving the diversity of pastures, but we also drive the biology, which really drive the rest of the system. So if we pop the plants in, the biology will do the rest of the work. And Christine Jones explains this really well by her liquid carbon pathway, not theory, but rule, I suppose. And this is the fact that the CO2 that a plant draws down from the atmosphere through photosynthesis about 40% of it, recent research suggests, is pumped into the soil deliberately by the plant to feed soil biology, and then the soil biology in return feed the plant nutrients and moisture. And it's a really positive feedback loop, a symbiotic relationship, and it really forms the base of a productive system in that regenerative sense. So the biology, while they're also improving the nutrient content of the plants and the moisture available to the plants, they also actually aggregate the soil as they're living in the soil system. They make themselves a nice little habitat down there. And that aggregation is really important, obviously, for soil structure, for aerating soils, particularly heavier, medium and heavy soil types, but also for helping us to store and sequester carbon, and also store and cycle moisture and nutrients. So we see a lot of benefits from optimising the plant diversity so that the biology can live and optimise our whole soil health and soil fertility. And we end up with a much more natural, potentially more profitable system than a more conventional system. So some of the projects that Heytesbury District Landcare Network has been involved with from a Regen Ag sense have been going since 2019, and they've just finished up now. And there were 3 projects that were classified as Regen Ag across that time period. And it grew over time to 30 farms in our last project, from 1 to 20 to 30. And the multi-species pastures as well as re-veg strategies came out as a winner, I suppose, in terms of being able to profitably adopt a Regen Ag strategy. So in the southwest on our dryland farms, we could double or triple the food on offer through that summer feed gap and early autumn feed gap that our more traditional pastures leave us with. And certainly we could reduce inputs as well because of that narrowing of the feed gap, or that obliteration of the feed gap, depending on the farm. So certainly fertiliser inputs, because there's a more stable fodder production across the year, but also the feeding out of conserved fodder or bought-in fodder as well. So some of those inputs started to go down, which was also very nice to see. But we ran into some difficulties sowing the multi-species pastures and mixes in spring into active pasture in a pasture cropping scenario. So Tony Evans, a colleague, and I came up with the cultivation calculator, which is on the Heytesbury District Landcare Network website. And it just is intended as a very loose guide to hopefully optimise that first, particularly the first sowing of the multi-species if it hasn't been sown on the farm before. So we identified through our project sites, through those 20 and 30 farms, that there were 4 main factors that that related to the success or failure of establishing the multi-species, especially into an active pasture. And we've put them down here in the cultivation calculator. So number 1 was time of sowing. The second was the previous paddock preparation within the last year, whether there'd been any cultivation or chemical termination. The previous pasture or crop, what we're sowing into, and the soil type, light, medium or heavy. And the aim of the calculator is for the farmer to pick the most appropriate scenario out of those 4 sections. To these ratings down in the middle column there are fixed, to pop the rating that most suits that farmer over into the your score column, and then to add them up at the end. So there'd be 4 numbers down adding up to a total score. And then down the bottom of the sheet, there's the recommended sowing method, and it really translates to heavy, medium and light intervention in terms of cultivation. And it's very much dependent, we believe, on those 4 factors. So this is just freely available, as I said, on the Heytesbury District Landcare Network, and just we hope that it will help to improve the establishment of those multi-species, because we did have difficulties with our lower intervention machines sowing into those heavy soils and those active pastures. Which brings us to the trial to date, or the sowing demonstration to date. So more info was obviously needed. And I went to the DDF and to Heytesbury and suggested that we put together another little demonstration site as a proof of concept site to potentially roll sowing demonstration sites out across the southwest. So this first site is really a proof of concept site just to gauge interest and productivity and attempt to understand the machines and the strategies for this heavy ground that we have in the southwest, and sowing directly into those active pastures. So the site is intended to also provide a return on investment for each of the machines that I chose, and to contrast the multi-species production and productivity versus the pasture. Also to give farmers confidence for those tougher paddocks. So we deliberately chose quite a tough site, and really wanted to give farmers a bit of confidence that the multi-species could establish well under pretty tough conditions, and also give some idea of the level of production, dry matter production, from what is essentially a worst case scenario. The final question, which will take quite a few years to answer, is can establishment intensity be reduced over time? So can we wean off potentially chemicals, but certainly cultivation over time on these medium to heavy soil types? And can a pathway be identified for, particularly when we're talking about cultivation, for these medium and heavy soils over time? So this little picture down the bottom is just the demonstration site layout. So it's a 2.5 hectare site. There is a control-based pasture on the east or the left of the site. And then we chose the SoilKee renovator, which is a fairly low impact machine, the Rotor strip tool, which is a much more impactful machine, and then the power harrow, which is commonly used in the district. So the SoilKee renovator and the Rotor strip tool are fairly new to the area, and certainly there needs to be a bit of work determining their best fit. All the 3 plots were sown with the mix that you can see on the right-hand side. So this soil, which we'll see in a moment, is a very heavy clay, and it needs aeration like you wouldn't believe. So there's lots of taproots in this mix, a very heavy rate of sunflowers and tillage radish in particular. There's also a bit of fodder rape and chicory in there to really drive those taproots down into the soil. Obviously, we have some fibre with the millet and then legumes as well. So quite a diverse mix, but again, is 10 species and is quite functionally diverse without being too impactful on the budget or too complicated to put together. So the site, our farmers were actually too good in the Heytesbury project pool, and we actually couldn't find a site that fitted all the scenarios. So we needed a site that had unterminated pasture, that ideally didn't have a lot of fertiliser history, which automatically knocked a lot of sites out, and that had a very, very heavy soil type, and stock could be included, could be excluded and included when necessary. So because of those reasons, we actually put this site on my little block just north of Campdown, predominantly because of the soil type being so tough. So this was the prerequisite, or the main prerequisite for the site. And this is the soil that we're dealing with at the moment. So this is only a 50-acre block. And this is a 10 centimetre roughly soil core from when we're shelter belting, revegetating the boundaries. And you can see a nice root mat at the top, and then straight into this very high mag, low calcium, sticky black cracking clay. So it is possible to make animals and shapes out of this. It is very much that Play-Doh-y clay that's very sticky in the winter and sets quite hard in the summer. So definitely we were testing both the machines and the multi-species at this site, and that was deliberately to show what they could do. We also made it a little bit tougher at this site and didn't put any starter fertiliser down with the multi-species. So it really is just how well the multi-species can perform out of a very tough environment. What we have done on the block is probably the two other, I suppose, big ticket items, I think, for the Southwest in terms of regen ag strategies, is that we have revegetated the south, west and central laneways of the block. So there were no trees on this block when we arrived. So we spent the last 4 years sowing lots of trees and also multi-species in between the trees when we've had to cultivate, which worked quite well. And we also do practice high intensity, short duration grazing management. So we have a very small mob of beef cattle. We strip graze them all year. And their fresh strip is moved daily forward, and they have a backing fence behind, and we bring the water with them. So it is quite labour intensive, but we have seen quite good results considering the ground that we're on. So the pasture's improved, we're starting to see less weeds, and we certainly aim for 100% ground cover 100% of the time. But we are missing the multi-species across the majority of the block. So that's our next aim, and we started off with this small little demonstration site. So these are just, I suppose, a summary of the sowing scenarios for the trial area, and we have the control pasture here that we left basically untouched, and we have the details for the SoilKee renovator, the rotor strip tool, and the power harrow here. So sown in February, which was a lot later than anticipated, but just was because of the wet season and the very late season last year. We just couldn't get contractors in here. Understandably, they had much bigger areas to work on than 0.6 of a hectare each. So we did intend to sow in December, but ended up sowing in February with a rainfall event on the horizon. So I did take a punt on the fact that there was a rainfall event coming, and got the machines organised, and luckily enough we did get some rain on the sowing day and in the next couple of days afterwards. So we did have a small calibration issue with the SoilKee renovator. We were lucky enough that a local farmer devoted his time to come and sow the site, but there was a little bit of a calibration issue with that machine. So it actually sowed twice as heavy as the other two plots. And also we have a difference between the sowing depth of the two pasture cropping machines, I would say, which we'll see in a moment, and the depth of the power harrow as well. So some small fluctuations, but sometimes that happens with demonstration sites. We did get good rainfall the day that the SoilKee renovator and the rotor strip till sowed. We had 55 mil the 2nd of Feb and the 3rd and 4th of Feb over those 3 days. The power harrow was sown 5 days after the rotor strip till and the SoilKee into moisture, but we didn't get significant follow-up rainfall until late February. You can see the costings here, the seed cost, the hourly rate for the machines. I have double-checked this with contractors, Logan's Contracting, who have the rotor strip till and the power harrow, and Heytesbury Regen Ag, who are at Irrawillippi, and they've given me some costings for the machines. We have a plot cost per machine here, and we also had to slug and certainly cricket bait across the area as well. So there's a little bit of cost for baiting there, and the total costs we'll come back to in a minute. But you can see certainly doing nothing with the control pasture has been relatively cost effective compared to sowing it, particularly because of the efficiencies of sowing such a small site. There's a bit of added cost in here because of the small area. So this is the SoilKee renovator doing its thing. So we did hard graze this plot area, or the whole trial area, deliberately, which was a little bit tough, but we managed it to really, really hard graze down to the ground to reduce that pasture competition. And then, of course, sowing in February has reduced pasture competition as well. But you can see the SoilKee renovator pasture crops, I would say, into the established pasture. So it doesn't entirely knock out the base pasture. It is more of an oversowing strategy to add diversity, which I quite like. And you can see on the front of the machine, there's a mulcher there as well. So the SoilKee can come with or without the mulcher, but the mulching certainly also helps to reduce that base pasture competition. You can also see in those sowing rows, they're quite slim, and the action of the blades on the SoilKee actually throws soil, or usually soil. In this case, it looks, it's root mat, but it throws that soil or root mat out of the sowing rows. So that helps to reduce the competition of the pasture, and sowing at depth helps to reduce the depth of the soil the seeds have to come out of. So that's the action of the SoilKee you can see there, and the bed that it left behind. Here is the rotor strip till. So you can see the SoilKee on the left-hand side, the rotor strip till directly in front. And this is the action of the rotor strip till. So it cultivates about 50% of the ground in comparison to the SoilKee, which is about 20%. So it's a much wider sowing row. but also doesn't throw any seed out of that sowing row, any soil out of that sowing row. So you can see the level of cultivation and breaking up that root mat on the right-hand side there. So both machines working pretty hard into this soil. Pre-rain, we hadn't had any rain for about 6 weeks at this site, and it was quite tough going. They did about 2 or 3 kilometres an hour, I think. So pretty tough on those machines to get through this soil, but nevertheless, they both managed it quite well. This is the Power Harrow, a much wider machine, so double the width of the other 2 machines, which does make it quite cost effective in terms of sowing. But you can see here the cultivation is intended to be 100%. So this was very shallowly sown, did leave a bit of the grass base pasture intact, and it has thrown up those clods. So it only did 1 pass, the Power Harrow, cultivating and sowing in the 1 pass. So fast forward to May, I had 2 field days. The first one with HB District Landcare Network, supported by the Corangamite Council. And you can see the establishment. We're in the Power Harrow plot having a look at the plants here. And this is the approximate establishment that we had at the time across the plots. So still very much in the vegetative sense and getting going after that autumn break. You can see here some nodulation from the vetch. So we broke this little nodule open and it was nice and healthy pink inside. So there's some good nitrogen fixation from our legumes in the mix, which was quite good because these, we got the seed in an awful hurry hoping to sow, and we didn't inoculate any of these legumes. So that vetch has been quite productive and fixing nitrogen all by itself, which is really great. And you can see the size of some of these tillage radishes. So this is a brassica that I really like to use because it has this quite large taproot. So this is only a couple of months after sowing in a really weird kind of timing, mid-February, early Feb timing. And you can see that tillage radish already opening up those heavy clay soils, which we really need at this site. There were about 80 people came to the block for the 2 days. So there was clearly that interest in the local area for both multi-species and probably to have a look at the machinery results as well. Fast forwarding again to the 1st of July, we kept the multi-species intact for the field days, and we weaned some beef calves onto here and started grazing. So you can see the strip fence. We're just starting grazing here on the 1st of July, and we did the dry matter cuts. So you can see the SoilKee renovator, which is the left-hand side picture, has been quite effective, but also has a lot of plants per sowing row. So did suffer a little bit in terms of the plants competing with each other because of that too high sowing rate. But I think very effective here at this site for what is a low intervention machine. And that's probably got a lot to do with the lack of competition because of the pre-grazing, the mulching and the time of sowing. And also having sown so deep but throwing some of that matter out of the rows, there has been quite a good establishment from that machine. So quite effective at this site, but certainly sowing timing and management strategies have helped quite a bit. The Rotor strip till we had used before in Heytesbury trials, and it was quite successful because of, I believe, of the width of that sowing row, and it is quite aggressively cultivated in that row. So you can see, however, that the establishment from 10 centimetres deep has been quite a bit patchier, but the overall plants are much larger than in the SoilKee strip. So that sort of correct sowing rate did help this rotor strip till establish, but you can see the rows have colonised back with some grasses as well. So there's been a reasonable amount of repair from that February sowing to the July dry matter cut date. What I like about both of these machines is that we can oversow a base pasture without having to either chemically terminate it or cultivate the entire paddock. So that leaves some base pasture intact if we're grazing, so that we do less damage with these machines rather than a full cultivation. And it gives us the opportunity to oversow a pasture that we may still be happy with, but that just needs diversity. So I think these 2 machines have quite a lot of merit for the Southwest and indeed across Victoria. So this is the worst and the best, I suppose, in terms of biomass. So this is just the control pasture plot just prior to grazing, and then the Power Harrow plot with dog. on the right-hand side there. So obviously that really shallow sowing hasn't impacted the seed mix as much as the deeper sowings. I actually wasn't sure how this would strike because there were crickets everywhere and there was a lot of seed lying on top of the ground, but it actually struck quite well from that very shallow sowing. So quite effective, the power harrow in this scenario. So this is just when we're doing some of the dry matter cuts. So you can see the control pasture on the left-hand side, and in the middle, one of the multi-species plots probably is the power harrow from the look of it. And you can just see obviously the diversity difference and the rough biomass that we're getting there. One thing that we did notice, my partner and I, was the size, particularly of the tuber species, so the turnips and the tillage radish in the mix. Their bulbs and tubers were impacted in the SoilKee sowing by the high sowing rate. So these tubers, Matt has this, my partner is holding this, and most of the tubers were quite slim and a little bit spindly because of the high sowing rate. Whereas this is one that he brought me to the house from the power harrow section. So you can see the difference between the tuber growth of those two. Both will be effective. These smaller tubers will still be effective at opening up that soil. But there's nothing like grabbing a massive tillage radish tuber out of the paddock and coming and crowing about it like Matt's done here. So you can see the difference between the two sowing rates there in terms of competition. The results of those dry matter cuts, the control pasture was reasonably high quality, obviously in that vegetative phase in midwinter, had slightly higher dry matter percentage compared to the multi-species mix, and gave us about 3.6 tonnes of dry matter to the hectare. So not overly tall, but reasonably dense. And because of having next to no inputs, quite cost effective in the amount of money it takes to produce each tonne of dry matter, which is about $18. Compared to our sowing plots, we've had considerable more cost. We have had a little bit of higher quality through those multi-species mixes. They're all the same. So I sent off one feed test, a composite feed test across the site for the mix, but they are obviously very similar in terms of what popped up. So we have a similar or the same quality all across the site. Slightly higher dry matter production in the power harrow plot at 5.7 tonnes compared to the rotor strip till and the SoilKee renovator. And because the power harrow took less time to sow the plot, it's come out as the most cost-effective sowing option at this site in this first year. So $108 to produce each tonne of dry matter versus the rotor strip till and the SoilKee at just over $160. So the weaners, we weaned 9 beef calves onto here. They stayed on that 2.5 hectares strip grazing for just over 2 months. Did very well on the multi-species. There was obviously enough fibre in there for them to not really have shitty bums, if I can say that. So that was really nice. It's something that we have noticed with the pasture. Sometimes in the middle of the winter, we can have them be quite loose, but they were really performing quite well on this multi-species. So that was very nice to see. And we would give them a strip which encompassed all the plots per day, and it was very clear that they wanted to stay in the multi-species rather than the pasture plot. So even though the quality was very similar, they did preferentially graze the multi-species. So just a very loose comparison to give you a bit of an idea of that production cost. In the Dairy Farm Wonder project, it assesses 25 dairy farms across the southwest, and their average cost of production per tonne of dry matter was $137 per tonne. So that's a very, very loose comparison, but it does give you some idea of costs of production in the southwest. So fast forwarding to last weekend, this is last Sunday, I had another small school visit from Mercy College in Camperdown come out about a week ago. So we pulled the weaners off the rest of the plot just to show the students some intact multi-species. And then we've mobbed up all of the mature cows and the weaners just to finish off this last little bit of the crop. So you can see on the left-hand side, the pasture control plot, growth since hard grazing in December, really. So 6 months or a bit more. And you can see on the right-hand side just the difference as they're coming out of the multi-species in terms of certainly the height of the biomass in comparison to the control pasture. This is the SoilKee strip on the left and the Rotor strip till on the right. Did look a little bit more impressive before they went in, but they ran around, gallivanted around for about an hour, and they're kicking up their heels thinking it was wonderful. So there's a lot of the crop that's been laid over, but nevertheless, you can see the height of it on those cows in there. You know, there is a reasonable amount of height, particularly of the radish. It's the white flowering plant that you can see, and it does become or bolt a little bit over the winter. So this is looking back up the paddock, and this is the residue that the weaners have left behind. So the rotor strip till on the left-hand side, I'm standing in the untouched strip between the rotor strip till and the SoilKee. But you can see there's next to no damage with these two machines. So they leave enough pasture intact, certainly for lighter stock in what has luckily been quite a dry winter for us, to not do very much soil damage at all in those two strips. So quite impressed that we could put a crop in and graze it, admittedly with light stock in a drier winter, but certainly have next to no soil damage with these two machines. So quite a good result, and we can see a bit of regrowth as well. On the right-hand side, that's just our root mat that we're still contending with. So this is picked up from the power harrow plot, and you can still see that very dense structure that we'll have to keep ameliorating over several years, I would say. In comparison, this is the power harrow plot. So you can see much more biomass in front of the fence, but certainly on the right-hand side, a little bit more soil damage, pugging damage at grazing. So even though we have, for us, had quite a what I would consider a dry July, August, we have had enough rainfall that it is damp out there rather than having standing water everywhere, which is nice, but there is enough moisture to do a little bit of pugging damage, especially if it's been a full cultivation. So the grazing management with light stock and keeping them moving is quite essential, especially if you happen to need to graze it in autumn and winter. So certainly there is a little bit more damage with the power harrow than there has been with the oversowing of the rotor strip till and the SoilKee. So what's next? We will sow the same site again with the same machines. We will go back to the DDF and gauge their interest in potentially, they help support us by funding the machines and the seed. We will go back and see if they're interested in continuing the site, or if they're interested in hopefully moving this trial to commercial farms. So I would like to see these sowing demonstrations spread out across the district rather than at my little block. I would very much prefer that. So we will hope to gain more funding either through the DemoDAIRY Foundation or other sources. At this little block, we'll sow the site again with the same machines regardless of funding, and hopefully we can show that there's enough interest to spread these trials out across the district. So the take-homes, the multi-species, given the site, the deliberately chosen tough site, and also the factors of a very late sowing and pest pressure, I think they established very well, and they maintained their quality for months. So this is something that's really handy about the multi-species, is that they, because of the mix of legumes and broadleaves in the multi-species, particularly if we focus on that and we keep the ratio of grasses or cereals to a level that there's enough fibre, but we are not hampering the quality of the mix, we can maintain that quality for months and have a feed wedge there when we need it. So that's really quite a win for multi-species and for farming in the southwest and across Victoria. At this first sowing, the power harrow was really cost effective on that heavy ground, predominantly because of the speed of its sowing across the ground, because of its much wider sowing row. So it was quite cost effective, but the other two machines I think also do have merit. And finally, grazing management. It is has been quite successful here, but across all farms, I believe that high intensity, short duration grazing with long rests is a big factor for success, whether it's on a multi-species or a conventional pasture. So particularly if you do sow a multi-species, though, that grazing management can really help you to get the most out of it. So I think from a soil perspective, we'll do some follow-up soil tests this spring once the temperature warms up a little bit and the biology are active. And we'll also do some visual soil assessments across the site, and hopefully we see some soil change. But my project trials to date have shown that I think we can have our cake and eat it too with these multi-species in terms of our fodder production, but also the ongoing soil health improvements. While we're making money out of these multi-species with our livestock, we have those ongoing beneficial soil improvements as well. So for a regen strategy, I think they're very applicable to livestock systems, and they can make a very big difference to the environmental and economic health of the business as well. So that's all from me. I'm happy to start taking questions now. I'll just leave this slide up here for a couple of minutes. They're just some resources if you're further interested in the multi-species that might help you get some more information. So, Michelle, do we have any questions to date?
There isn't anything in the chat, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat or just unmute yourselves and have a go at asking. Jade, if no one's got any questions at the moment, I've got a question. It's been really interesting to see the photos and how it's compared. I've really enjoyed that, so thank you. I was just wondering, what were the big surprises in terms of this particular demonstration? Was there anything that took you by surprise that you weren't expecting?
I actually, I liked the SoilKee renovator, but we had difficulty establishing across the Heytesbury trials. So we sowed in spring in a much more active pasture time of the year, I suppose, which was the main factor. But we had very little success with the SoilKee sowing into those active pastures. And I was a little bit worried about how it would establish under still a little bit of pasture competition, but certainly such a heavy root mat and such a tough soil to get into. And I was pleasantly surprised by the job that it did. I was also pleasantly surprised by the Rotor strip till. I thought the soil in such a wide sowing row might settle and we might have trouble with it in a wet winter, but we didn't have that wetter winter, which obviously helped, but it didn't settle as much as I thought either, and has relatively maintained that soil structure. So I was quite impressed by both our novel machines to the district, how they worked on such a tough site and how they preserved the soil structure in an autumn and winter grazing.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any questions for Jade?
Yeah, Andrew here.
Hello, Andrew.
How you going, Jade? Thanks for your presentation.
I'm well, and you?
Very
interesting. No worries.
So was there any fertiliser applied?
No fertiliser. So deliberately, because I wanted to present farmers with, I suppose, a worst case production scenario. So really treating the multi-species quite meanly and giving them no fert. This block's had no prior fert history either, as far as, well, it's been a hobby block for a long time. It's been a 50-acre block for quite some time, and we haven't applied any fertiliser either. So we aim to foliar fertilise in the future, but we haven't done so yet. So we really did just sow the site with the intention that the multi-species would be the only thing, and we could attribute all production to the diversity of the species. Those heavy soils of yours, although you haven't fertilised, would still be probably quite high in nutrient content. They probably still have, what are the P levels, like Olsen P levels? NPK is okay. It's not awfully high. It's on the borderline. It's about 12, so it is on the borderline of productivity. Our biggest constraint is the calcium to magnesium ratio. So we have about 1:1. So there is an enormous amount of magnesium in that soil and very little calcium. And our pH is about 5 in calcium chloride. So that's our biggest constraint.
So would is lime appropriate there to try and ameliorate
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah, lime and gypsum are. We're playing around with whether we apply solid or liquid calcium and gypsum. I think we'll start off with liquids and then see if we need to do a solid application as well.
So is that a pH of 5 in water, is it?
Calcium chloride.
Calcium chloride. Oh, okay. Yep. So if you're using gypsum, so it's just a question. So gypsum's calcium sulfate, isn't it?
Yes.
K4. So because your soils are acidic and the calcium, we're looking at the calcium replacing the magnesium to make the clay more aggregatable. And then you've got that SO4 double negative ion running around. Does that react with water to form sulfuric acid and make your pastures more acidic?
It has that potential, and also any sulfates are, I suppose, detrimental to soil biology. So that's why we're thinking of doing foliar applications first and adding more multi-species rather than a huge whack of solid gypsum and lime. So we would do the two together if we were to do a solid application, and we'd do the two together in a liquid as well to try and ameliorate some of that gypsum effect. But we do have to be careful for the effect on the soil and the soil biology.
So I've often wondered about the chemistry of that. I suppose, like with lime being calcium carbonate, it means that the carbonate could react with water and form carbonic acid, but that might be a less invasive acid compared to sulfuric acid coming from the gypsum. So I've often wondered about that in terms of so is that one of the reasons why that it's like in our soils where we are with our fine sandy clay loams and, you know, pH of about 5.6 in water or 4.8 in calcium chloride. So we've been using lime rather than gypsum because we don't have those high clay contents, but
that's fine.
But as you go further north, when you get out on the alluvial plains, or volcanic plains, the pH is higher, so they can probably get away with using the gypsum and get that exchangeable cation activity of calcium replacing magnesium, and that probably helps there. And the sulfuric acid thing's not so much of an issue in their high pH soils. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd say that's right, and it very much depends on the soil type. So I would prefer lime over gypsum, except where that magnesium is through the roof, like it is here. So certainly lime, I believe, is a softer option.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jay.
No worries.
Jodie's popped a question into the chat. She's asked, do you have any recommendations or resources for sandy soils?
Yes. So it depends a little bit what exactly you're looking for, Jodie. So cultivation wise, that cultivation calculator, if you're looking at cultivation recommendations, does I suppose encompass a sandy soil scenario. So cultivation wise, you could look at the calculator if you needed to. Species wise, if you're sowing a multi-species, most of the species that we've used here would be applicable. There's not too many that I wouldn't use. The taprooted species in a light sandy soil will help you to improve your organic matter and your organic carbon, and they will still drag nutrients from depth. You may not need to use quite the ratio that we have here because you don't need to aerate that soil, but they're still valuable on a sandy soil type. So species-wise, certainly chat to me if you'd like. There are some recommendations I've put forward on the North Central CMA website that I had the slide up before with the resources. There's some tips for lighter soil types and sowing. And I think there's an article floating around for Vic No-Till that deals with potentially lighter soil types, lower rainfall, and spring and summer sowing, as well as autumn sowing. So there's a few resources I can put you in touch with if you'd like to send me an email later.
And there's no one else asking a question, I'll ask another one.
Go, Andrew.
Yeah. So which were the most successful species apart from the Daikon radish in your trial? Yeah.
I really liked the vetch. The vetch
Yep.
was very strong, nodulated really, really well. Sunflowers, we did see some sunflowers, but I think that later sowing date and the crickets, they probably got eaten, a lot of them. The millet was probably the only disappointment. I believe I probably got eaten by crickets, and it got buried at depth with the SoilKee and the Rotor strip till, but we didn't see a lot of millet in the Power Harrow plot either. So whether or not that got eaten by crickets or there was some reason why it didn't establish very effectively, the millet was the only species that we didn't really see as part of the mix.
That's good. I was interested to see significant difference in the sowing depth of the Rotor strip and the SoilKee being at 10 centimetres compared to the Power Harrow of 3 centimetres. But there still seemed to be a similar strike rate. Well, probably better. It was better in the Power Harrow, wasn't it, the strike rate?
It certainly was visually better in the Power Harrow, but it's also a little bit difficult to visually assess because the SoilKee and the Rotor strip till are only giving you strips of multi-species and then a strip of pasture and then another strip of multi-species. So as you look across it, it doesn't look as impressive, I suppose, as a Power Harrow, which cultivates and sows the whole area. So I was quite impressed with the two machines in terms of their establishment, particularly given the depths of sowing. Visually and biomass-wise, the Power Harrow was better, but I still was impressed with the other two machines.
You actually just broke up a bit then, Jay, here. Could you just repeat that last paragraph, please?
Where did you get to, Andrew? Sorry.
Just before biomass, you're talking about biomass, I think, because of the strike rates and the effectiveness of it.
Yeah, so because the Power Harrow cultivates the whole area, it looks more impressive, and there will be a better establishment rate. Yeah. But the SoilKee and the Rotor strip till in those sowing rows still established quite well, especially at depth. So the Power Harrow, cost effectively wise, because it was faster across the ground because of the width of the machine, and it did give us a little bit higher establishment rate and growth rate. It's come out in front, but I'm still impressed with how the other two machines established the mix.
They're pretty similar in the biomass, really. The three of them, weren't they? They were similar.
Yes. Yeah.
And
they were. So you go.
But there's a high proportion of multi-species in the Power Harrow, so therefore the quality would be higher, as well, because of that. There's less grass and more multi-species and diversity in the pasture.
Yes, that's right. And we tried to keep the biomass cut quite impartial as well. So in the Rotor strip till, in the Power Harrow, where the base pasture was left, which is a foxtail, strawberry clover sort of base, the crickets did really get into that. So they liked the fact that the soil had been a little bit disturbed and there were clumps and things that they could get under, and they stayed a lot in that Power Harrow area. So they actually took a lot of that grass. They killed a lot of the grass base pasture in the Power Harrow section. So that's contributed a little bit to it. It had to sort of regrow from the autumn break, that pasture. And the other thing we did, because the Power Harrow had so many tubers, we took some cuts across the site with and without tubers. But because the SoilKee and the Rotor strip till had smaller tubers than the Power Harrow, above ground tuber biomass, that's probably where we took the tubers out of the equation. So we did some cuts with and some cuts without tubers, and then averaged the weight. So where we've taken the tubers out of the Power Harrow section, that's probably given it a lower biomass than it really has.
And the other thing is that, I mean, one of the ideas of the of the rotor strip and the SoilKee is to leave some undisturbed pastures, so the biological activity of the soil isn't interfered with so much compared to when we're doing complete cultivation with the power harrowing. So there's a factor there, I suppose, if we can get away with, say, a rotor strip compared to power harrow. Of course, it depends what the objectives are too, I know, but I mean that's one of the reasons for doing that SoilKee in rotor strip, is to try and have the best of both fields, is to maintain the integrity of the soil structure in a percentage of the paddock, but to have the mixed species coming as well. So there are both factors involved. I suppose it depends on where, probably, I guess that if it was a really poor pasture, you'd say, well, power harrow and go for it. Whereas if you've got a reasonably good pasture, we'll keep the best of both worlds there.
That's right. And I think it depends a little bit on the sowing timing as well. So if it was spring and the pastures were active and you didn't necessarily want to employ a herbicide, the power harrow or the rotor strip till is probably going to do a better job establishing that multi-species, because of the rotor strip till with the wider sowing width is better at establishment, but the power harrow, of course, destroys everything. So it obviously does improve the establishment. But if you had a pasture that was not as dominant and you wanted to sow into it, you could use either the rotor strip tool or the SoilKee. And it depends very much whether you want to retain that pasture. As you said, if it's a bent grass pasture and you'd rather get rid of it entirely, that's where the power harrow comes into its own, especially on these heavier soils. But if you had a base pasture that you weren't too unhappy with, but you just wanted to add that diversity, I think that's where those two strip till machines are really valuable.
So if we've got a ryegrass paper, we want to get chicory and plantain and other clovers into there, then would it be best to do a springtime or an autumn sowing with, say, a rotor strip or a SoilKee in that scenario?
It depends. I know stock-wise you've got sheep, so they're obviously going to be much less damaging on that soil in the winter if you cultivate in the autumn than cattle would be. So it depends a little bit how late maturing your ryegrass is, and then, of course, the forecast for the year as well. So this spring, ideally, you'd be sowing as early as you could because it's likely going to be a bit drier. But then that depends on the level of competition you'd have from the base pasture. So the SoilKee straight into a mid-spring sowing may not be as effective. It might be better sowing just before the autumn break when your ryegrass pasture in autumn isn't as competitive. So it does depend very much on the paddock and the season forecast as well.
What are the latest ideas about the allelopathic effect of ryegrass on multi-species crops if you're using this sort of scenario?
I don't think it's well, we've sowed into an awful lot of ryegrass paddocks, and it's machine centric rather than any allelopathy. I think it's a factor, but because especially when we're sowing the annual multi-species, I don't think it's a make or break factor.
And I take it that the SoilKee cultivates about 17% and the rotor strip about 50%. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting area of study, isn't it? Trying to work all this
very
stuff.
much so.
That's fantastic. Yes. I reckon that what you're doing is giving a really good go to try and get a better handle on it. I think I like the way you're bringing a lot of science and measurement into it, and
yes.
And that's what we've got to do. And obviously, then we have to tailor the results of various areas to think about our particular circumstances and what is the best scenario there.
That's right. Thank you.
That's great. And we'd love to have chicory and plantain and more clovers in every paddock. I mean, we're going down that track. Yes. You're working with us and we're getting somewhere now, but just sort of thinking about climate change and the fact that if there's going to be the climate climatologists are saying that in our area there's probably going to be less rainfall, but a skew more to summer rainfall. So if we got the appropriate species there, so we can have 100% ground cover 100% of the time, like you said before, which is a really good comment. But get this chicory and plantain, which will respond to those summer rains, you know, and get that depth.
Yes.
The ryegrass roots just aren't very deep, and we want to get down there, explore the horizon, and get the appropriate clovers, and end up with something like that. So that's sort of that's some of our thinking anyway, apart from other things we're thinking about too.
I think though, especially the herbs, the chicory and the plantain, they're just excellent in a mix. And as you said, those deeper roots are amazing. I have a trial in Gippsland on an irrigated dairy farm, and they've put some soil moisture probes in on a ryegrass clover pasture versus a deep-rooted multi-species pasture. And the ryegrass is drawing moisture to 30 centimetres depth, and the multi-species is drawing to 60 centimetres. And that's the limit of the probe. That's the 60 centimetres depth is how far it's reading. So it's probably drawing moisture from below that. And the difference is just the deeper roots.
Yeah, that's an interesting result, isn't it?
Okay, hi everyone.
Ask the questions. So I don't want to be hogging all the. I'll shut up for a while and give someone else a go.
Go, Sarah.
Hi everybody. I went to jump in a couple of times and was too slow, but
sorry.
No, Andrew, it's all right. You covered everything and some really great stuff in there. I feel like we've been planning some of these stuff for a few years now and seen some great results in our area, and it's really interesting, Jade, to see your trials with the different cultivation methods, because we've had mixed results over the years with spraying or not spraying, or cultivating or direct drilling, and sort of settled on a process that works for us as far as summer mixed species. Well, we've always planted summer crops, but growing the mix of those species a lot, which is we can really see the benefits of, and then getting some of that into our, similar to Andrew, changing our pastures from a ryegrass clover mix across to still ryegrass and more clovers, but phalaris, cocksfoots, sort of other chicory, plantain as well. And we know our biggest limiting factor at this point is getting some more fencing up, controlling that and being able to manage that grazing. So that's huge and time consuming, but getting there slowly. But I think it's great just seeing people embracing this more. Now, Jade, I wanted to ask quickly, I was trying to have a look at your last slide and it disappeared too quickly for me, but the trial in West Gippsland, I was interested because I have just come back yesterday from West Gippsland on a work trip. We were looking more at dairies in the Corner Inlet area, and then the McAllister irrigation, more around effluent management. But they did mention a couple of times they were sort of doing some trials, but didn't elaborate on anything. We did meet your sister very briefly as well. So
I bet that was confusing.
Connect the dots a little bit, but I was curious around, sort of, I think it was the West Vic Dairy sort of mentioned they were doing some, regen ag type mixed species trials, but the people there didn't really know much more about it than that. So is that the same trials you're talking about, I'm assuming, with the West Gippsland CMA, or is that different stuff?
Yeah, so I believe West Vic Dairy are putting together a focus farm type initiative with a group of farms. The West Gippsland CMA funded a 4-year trial on an irrigated dairy that's gone from an annual multi-species versus annual pastures to a perennial multi-species. Did you all hear me then?
No, you really froze then. Okay. So, that's part of the Dairy Australia trial across the whole, not just West Gippsland, isn't it? We're comparing the species. That's a different one again. Yeah,
so the West Gippsland CMA trial I was involved in has just finished, but it was a 4-year trial just on one farm assessing multi-species with conventional management. And I finished the report maybe a month or two ago, and it should be released very soon.
Yeah,
So it'll be out and about for public view.
That'd be yeah, great to see, because we did see a lot of just straight ryegrass driving around. Yeah.
Yes.
That'll be really interesting. Yeah. Cool. No, thank you.
Thanks,
No
Jade.
worries.
There's just one more question. We might leave it as the final one in the chat. So Jodie's just asked if anyone has tried to direct drill multi-species, just quickly.
Oh,
and then we'll let you all go.
definitely, Jodie. So prior to the Heytesbury trials, I've worked with the Central Vic regen farmers. Hi, Steve. Steve, I can see in the middle here. He's tried to direct drill multi-species pastures. We had quite a few farmers in the Central Vic regen farmers group direct drill. I've tried to direct drill myself. I've seen quite a few farmers across Gippsland and the southwest direct drilling as well, and it's very difficult to achieve if that pasture base is competitive. So direct drilling without a herbicide in front to be almost non-existent, really, particularly that for that transition time, that first 1 to 3 times that you're super tough to get right to work, and you have to have a light soil type as well. So we have all tried it at various times. I did sow multi-species here on the block in 2018 and direct drilled it after a hay cut, and I still didn't have any success. And so I would, unless it's a very unique set of circumstances, I would try and do some level of cultivation or some herbicide application before that direct drilling, unless you are quite a long way down the pathway of sowing multi-species and the paddock and the weed burden and the soil has responded accordingly. You probably can start to shift towards lower intensity sowing options, but certainly the first couple of years, I think it's all about some cultivation or some chemical. Unfortunately, we just have to be practical and realistic about that in most scenarios.
Can I just comment, Jade?
Of course, Steve.
Yeah, we've had very mixed results. We ideally started without any interventions and direct drilled, and yeah, we wasted a bit of diesel and a bit of seed. We also had a very dry year that year. We had one that came up that Jade may remember called Fred in the middle of the paddock. It wasn't so successful. This last autumn, I did some deep ripping on another paddock that we've just done, and we've had really good establishment in that one. So that cultivation made a huge difference this time, and other times where we've sprayed, we've had much better results on that initial sowing direct drilling. Again, so much is dependent on rainfall in our area, particularly with the summer or the spring. We don't have the southwest guarantees of moisture that many of you may enjoy. We're much more have much bigger fluctuation. But yeah, I'd echo what Jade said. And Christine Jones, actually, when she came and visited our place, said, look, sometimes you need to wreck it to fix it, and a deep grip, to break up hard pans and to get soil opened up, and then follow it straight in with your deep rooted tillage radishes and so on. One issue we've had, we actually haven't been able to get the plantain to establish. With chicory's done all right for us, but plantain hasn't really taken off either. Love to see more of it. You can see it on the roadsides, but it doesn't want to grow in the paddock. So I need to work on that one a bit more. But yeah. So Jodie, yeah, do the preparation work if you're going to direct drill.
Thank you, Steve. That was really interesting. Thanks for your input. So I think we'll wind up there. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Jade. That was really, really interesting. So it was great to run through your results, and I'm sure we'll be able to follow all your further work in the future.
Lovely. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Keep well. Bye-bye.